moving through the school years, and I've heard you talk about this a bit, so give it as much or as little detail as you want, but grew up in Auckland and parents found marijuana in your room at 14. You got sent to Wanganui College where you were expelled there for weed. And I've heard you describe it as the lowest point in your life. Yeah, give it as much or as little as you want, and perhaps what you learnt from that period.
Well, yeah, it was a crazy time, and I, looking back on it, I feel like I was a different person, but I'm obviously the same person. But I was at school here in Auckland. I must have been at the end of year 11. What's that, fifth form?
Fifth form.
And it was a school holidays, and I was experimenting at the time with marijuana, as it seemed that most people I knew anyway of my age were, and my parents were reasonably conservative, and also they were very staunchly anti-drugs, and look, not anti-alcohol to a point, but certainly anti-getting wasted. Like, they always had alcohol in the house, and they always drank very moderately. They're very moderate people. They're not extreme people. And so I think my mother particularly would have been disappointed to think that I was interested in chasing some kind of experience through,
Devil's lettuce.
Yeah, through drugs. Because she doesn't really understand why you'd want to do that. To her, that makes no sense. Why would you want to lose control, or why would you want to feel different? Whereas I thought, well, that's actually quite interesting. So anyway, they found some drugs in my room over the holidays, and then immediately within about, it felt like 2 or 3 days, it was coming towards the end of the holidays, I was at Wanganui College. I was in the headmaster's office, and I was, doing an interview to go to school down there, because I think my parents thought the problem is Auckland, obviously. There's drugs in this big city. Send them to Wanganui. There'll be no marijuana down there.
That was quite a prestigious school back then, wasn't it? Wanganui College.
Yeah, it's a very traditional school.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very old. I think it was set up in the 1860s or something. And it was based very much around an English public school. And so, anyway, I went down there for a year. That was all good. And I enjoyed it. I made good friends, went to boarding school. It seems odd that I sort of just took it in my stride at the time. I thought, oh, yeah, okay, this is what's happening. I'll try and make the best of this situation. It's not really where I wanted to go, but I thought, well, what choice do I have? So I was down there, and then at the end of the year, you get to choose a week experience at the end. Once you've done all your exams and all that sort of stuff in sixth form, there's this period of time in those days where you had nothing to do.
Yeah,
do you remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that. And I didn't have anything, and I did Kung Fu at school with Mr. Pinkerton. It's a real Hamilton Boys reference out there, which will get a lol from people. Well, I do remember that really vividly.
Yeah, because you finished in like November or something. It was weird, and there was just this period of purgatory where nothing good came of that period. It's just like, what a 16-year-old's going to do when they've got nothing to do? Well, something bad. So anyway, they at school, instead of sending you home, they sent you away at boarding school to Wanganui College to a community experience week, and you could choose different things. My choices were, I remember, an old person's retirement village, and you stay there for a week
on site.
Yeah, you stay at a motel, or I think, and that one was in Wanganui, so I think we stayed at school, and they drive you with the school bus there. There was Lake Alice, was in those days they were called mental hospitals. They're not, obviously they don't even exist anymore, but that was what they were called in those days. Like a institution, a psychiatric ward, yeah. And then another option, there were other options, and then another option was the NSAD Drug Treatment Centre in Marton, which I thought to myself, well, of all the options here, I can this is kind of interesting to me. I thought this will be interesting, whereas I'd heard terrible stories about what happened at Lake Alice, and I didn't really want to be dealing with old people. So there I was. And then before I went along there, we were staying in a motel because it was in Marton and the school's in Wanganui. And I was like, yes, finally teachers are not looking. We can do whatever we want. And I knew that we were working during the day, and then you'd cook your own meals at night and then just hang out in the motel at night. And I was like, no teacher with us, all good. So I thought, now's a good time to, and I'd spent the whole year, I hadn't smoked pot all year. I'd been good. And because I'd sort of promised my parents that I'd try my hardest. And it'd been a good year. And then so I thought, I'll treat myself here, finish my exams. And I won't get in any trouble for this. So then, anyway, got a cap of hash oil or cannabis oil, and and then went away there, and then worked away for a few days, and met a whole lot of good people. It was really interesting. I was enjoying it actually, and then having interesting conversations with people. And then I hadn't smoked any of the cannabis oil at this stage. I was sort of waiting for an opportunity at night, and it hadn't presented itself. And then one of the patients there came up to me just before I was going to leave, or probably on the third day, and said, I heard you've got some drugs. And I said, no. And then they said, well, that's not what one of the other guys who was here said. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's not true. And then sort of described what I had and where it was and all sorts of things. And at that point, I was like, oh, this is not good. I found myself in a kind of a difficult situation. And he was reasonably coercive, and I didn't have the skills to negotiate my way through it as well as I would have liked. And in the end, I ended up giving it to him, and not, which is a terrible idea, and sounds, that sounds like the worst thing in the world. But I didn't want any money for it. It wasn't. In the end, I actually threw it on the ground, and I said, if you want to pick it up, that's all good. Because I felt like I didn't really have an option. And he did. He just picked it up, and then he had it. I think he swallowed it, I assume, because the next day when I came in, it was. So I went home that night thinking that was a mistake. This is bad.
Because you were 16, 17.
Yeah, I was 16, into sixth form. And I knew that what I'd done was wrong, but I just felt like I didn't really have any other option, even though I did have an option. The thing is, he also was saying, I'm going to tell the people anyway, and I was like, fucked here. So he then swallowed it, then came back the next day, and people just shaking their heads, and I knew exactly what was going to happen. And I saw him, and he was really stoned, is what he was. He just had red eyes, and a stoned person at a sober
really
rehab facility, boy, do they stand out. And then we had the family meeting, and then they stood up, and they made me stand up, and then they said, Jeremy, what have you done? And I told them what had happened. And then just, one by one, people just stood up and just laid into me. I remember just standing there in tears. It was pretty brutal, but fair enough. I take, I was like, well, this is fair enough. And then the guy called me into the main office and said, who was in charge of the facility, and said, this is obviously not an ideal situation. I said, no, I know. And he said, I've got to tell the school. I said, yeah, I understand that. And then he said, don't worry, I'll talk to the school, and I'm sure they'll understand these drug addicts. Because this person, everyone was called an addict, even though this guy probably was just trying to get off a lighter sentence because he had said that he was a drug, I assume, and you go to a rehab facility for 6 months and you get a lighter sentence. But everyone was considered an addict, even if they smoked marijuana in those days. So he was like, these addicts can be, very persuasive and all that sort of stuff. So the deputy headmaster came and then picked me up and then drove me back. They put me in solitary confinement at the school. Then they went through my study and looking for drugs and all sorts of stuff. And I was being treated like I sort of deserved to be, really, which is essentially a criminal. And marijuana at that stage was illegal. And I think even cannabis oil may be like class B or something. Who knows? And then my parents came down because they were, I was going to be expelled. So they came down, and then I remember walking into the headmaster's office. There's my parents. There's a headmaster. Very traditional old room. My parents just, I've never seen such, disappointment. And then, I got expelled. And then my parents then had said to me before I left, this is your last chance. Because before they'd sent me down to Wanganui, we'd been having some problems. And then they said, this is your last chance. And, if you muck this one up, that's it. You're not part of this family anymore. And I was like, whew, okay. But I thought, I won't muck it up. I'll be okay. And so at that point, when we walked out of the headmaster's office, my parents were like, oh, well, we told you what we told you, and see you later. And they just drove off. And so I was just left in Wanganui by myself, standing outside the headmaster's office. They've gone. And then I go back to the sanatorium where I'd been staying, which is like the hospital thing, solitary confinement. I was getting my meals brought to me like a prisoner. And then that night I got put on the Northerner train back to Auckland and ended up going and staying with a friend of mine for a few months. And so that was it for me. That was my expulsion. And you know, my parents practicing, I guess, what they thought was tough love back in those days. A pretty brutal manoeuvre by them, but I got to say, quite good, because if that hadn't have happened, I don't think anything else I think a whole lot of other things would have happened that all worked out quite well in the end.
Yeah, bold strategy.
Yeah.
Bold strategy, which has paid off.
Big call from my parents. My parents are pretty tough people, you know. They at their heart, and also they're very principled. And I think they thought, well, we said this, and we have to follow through with it now. But I mean, you'd never do that now, would you?
No.
I mean, I wouldn't do that to my kids. But look, in the end, it was probably the right thing to do. Well, it was the right thing to do.
Well, thank you for sharing it. There's one point I just want to kind of go back on as well, is just for clarity's sake, that trip home on the Northerner after you were expelled, is that a different trip to the trip on the Northerner, which I referred to earlier, which is the story of you losing your virginity? I just want to make, just for clarity's sake, that they're two different Northerner trips.
Totally different Northerner trip. I made 3 trips on the Northerner in my year at Wanganui College.
Two very memorable. for very different reasons.
Yeah, there were 2. You're right. There were 2 very memorable ones and one that I can't remember anything about. In fact, was there? I think there may have only even been 2. They were both very memorable. Yeah, I lost my virginity on one, and the other one was a different feeling altogether. I remember going home, and I remember being on this train, and I thought, God, this is a disaster. You know, what are you? I never thought that I was going to be a person who'd be expelled from a school. I just wasn't that type of person. You know, okay, I pushed the boundaries at certain times, but I was never I was not an expulsion. Like in those days, getting expelled was
a big deal.
Oh man, it was a big deal. Because, you know, before that we had canings and all sorts of stuff. But being expelled, that means you're a bad person. You know, that means you're a bad person. And yeah, I just remember there were a couple of incidents there, and definitely I used to smoke in those days, and I remember being up the front of the area where you smoke. And it was night time because it left at 11 o'clock at Marton. So you go through the night, and I remember thinking, what do you do in this situation? I thought, I think you're meant to kill yourself. And I just thought, I think that's what I'm meant to do. That would be the honourable thing to do in this situation. You know, you brought such shame to your family. And luckily, I just didn't have the guts to do that. But I mean, looking back on it, that was a moment. But yeah, I just would never have the guts to be able to do something like that. But
yeah,
but it's definitely a thought that I had.
Yeah, well, thank God you pushed through, because so many people do have those thoughts and take the other path.
Yeah, well, luckily for me, I wasn't a case of so much. You know, as I said, it wasn't. It was just a thought. But that was it. It was not something that I was really an option for me. Luckily.
So life is in disarray. There's only one thing to straighten you out, and that's a little trip back down to Hamilton, and that's a year at St. Paul's. Now, you probably don't know this, but we're proud ambassadors. We're both from Hamilton. We've got this movement going, people really proud to be from Hamilton, proud of the city, and it seemed like it straightened you out.
Oh, it was a good school, and it was a good time, and I met great people. I met ACC head G Lane there. He was in my team, cricket team. I met great friends. It was a much less strict school, St. Paul's in Hamilton, and the headmaster there as well, Steve Cole, understood boys and had I think he'd done a few things himself, and so he realised how boys think, and I think he spotted a kindred spirit in me. I've seen him recently actually, and he was very good to me, I've got to say. He did say to me when I went to the interview to go back to school, because eventually I ended up reconciling with my parents after a couple of months. And then they said, look, you've got to go back to boarding school, otherwise you can't be part of this family. I was like, oh, okay, here we go again. So I'm driving down to Hamilton. And he said to me, Steve Cole was like, Jeremy, normally, because he spoke like Graham Henry, normally I would give people 2 or 3 chances. If they did something wrong at the school, for you get no chances. You do one thing wrong and you are out that door quick as a flash. And I remember that was the thing he said to me in the interview. But then luckily nothing bad happened.
So he didn't see you stoned on the roller doing the
He
cricket
never caught
fits.
me doing anything. He didn't want to catch you doing anything. Actually, that was the difference between that school and Wanganui. Wanganui, they wanted to catch you doing bad things. Like they knew that people were out there doing bad things, and they wanted to find them. Whereas St Paul's, they knew that you were doing bad things, but they did not want to find them. They were like,
It's Hamilton, baby.
Yeah.
if it doesn't hit us in the face, we'll just let it slide. And I was super lucky as well. I had a housemaster there called Paul Wilson who, geez, he was a nice man. And he was a classic example of like, if everyone's nice and everyone's getting along, I'm not going to go looking for problems here. And as a result, everybody got on better, and he just gave you a little bit more rope, and things were just a bit easier. Because it's quite hard being at boarding school. Where do you experiment with all of these things? Where are you meant to be a teenager? At school the whole time? It's hard to do.
Before we move into the Hevo days, claim to fame has been wedged between Dan Vittori on the St. Paul's Honours Board. Was that for a fifer?
Yeah, that's right. That's my proudest moment. I got 5 wickets against Hamilton Boys High in 1994 in a Gillette Cup match.
Wow.
Yeah, 6 for 24, and we bowled them out for 108, and got into the Gillette Cup semi-final as a result of that. That's my greatest moment in life. There's no doubt about that. Everything was coming together that day in front of the school. I think I was embarrassingly in those days. I'd celebrate wickets a little bit too much, and I think at the time Ian Botham was doing some weird kind of dance where he'd stick his fingers up in the air and sort of shake his bum. And I remember at the end of it, my mum came down to watch, and at the end she goes, oh, "You bowled well today, but did you have to do that dance every time you got a wicket?" It's like, yeah, unfortunately. Yeah.
Do you ever go to any old collegiate events? Do you ever roll into Hamilton these days? Can we count on your support as a ambassador? Is basically what I'm saying.
Look, I had a great time in Hamilton, and I will always remember the wonderful hospitality that was shown to me in the Waikato in 1994. I'll never forget that.
Very good.
And the good-natured vibe in the Waikato, and also the fact that in the Waikato, drinking is just it's quite impressive the way that, I mean, at our school we had alcohol at our ball. I mean, how many balls?
Yeah, I went to a St. Paul's after ball once. I ended up in Taupo. It was a hell of a night.
Hold on, the alcohol at the after ball, but at the actual ball, I mean, who turns
Oh,
up?
yeah.
And we've got drink tickets, and you're allowed 5 drinks. I mean,
Really?
yeah,
5?
we're allowed 5 drinks.
Standards.
Yeah, like beer or wine.
Yeah.
What the hell?
Amazing.
That was a good time.
Yeah. Sounds like we've got him. Ambassador.
Yeah,
Put him
we
on our
definitely-
list.